like to talk about critics of the West today. We all hear about the boosters of the West. We see the manifestations of Western success throughout the globe, whether it's Facebook or oil drilling in Saudi Arabia or the military power of the United States or the Nobel Prizes or literary prizes that go to Europeans and Americans, and the dominance, cultural, political, military, economic, that the Western system exercises. But what's wrong with it? Why do people seem to be ambiguous about it? And I would like to suggest today that that's not new. There have always been critics of the West, most often, oddly enough, Westerners themselves. Plato was a critic of the West, of Greek culture. Where did Plato live? Right in the heart of it, in Athens. Michael Moore, Sean Penn despise many things about American culture. Where do they operate out of? Southern California. So we have an ambiguous relationship between wanting to be part of the West and wanting to criticize it, perhaps to improve it, perhaps for other psychological or philosophical reasons to express distaste with it. But before we talk about critics of the West, what do we mean by the West? And that's a term that's both geographical and cultural. It transcends time and space. Originally, the West was just what? 50,000 square miles in Greece, about 1.5 million people. The city-state, the polis. All of a sudden in the 8th century BC, this thing springs up out of nowhere, and with it we have these institutions such as constitutional government, free economics, free speech, philosophy, drama, tragedy, history. We know the whole story of Greek civilization. And within 3 centuries, this dynamic system had spread throughout the southern Mediterranean and had been incorporated by Rome, Italy. And within 2 centuries of the end of the Republic, you could say that Roman culture, Mare Nostrum, our sea, extended from, as I said, nearly Scotland to the Sahara Desert, or from the Euphrates to the Atlantic Ocean. It was an incredible achievement. It was based on modifications of early Western civilization, modifications of the Greek city-state. It developed something called res publica, the public thing, republican government that had checks and balances on the use of power, which would transmogrify into the imperial system. They had a more expansive notion of citizenship. You didn't have to look Italian or speak Latin to be a member of the Roman Commonwealth. This system, for a variety of reasons, imploded, at least in the West, in the 5th century AD. It maintained an Eastern component for another 1,000 years at Constantinople in what we call the Byzantine Empire, from roughly the 470s after the fall of the West all the way to 1453 with the fall of Constantinople, and into the 1460s and 70s with strongholds in the Eastern Mediterranean and within Greece itself that held out. But as Rome in the West fell, it was incorporated, or its legacy or its fumes were incorporated in Northern Europe. And through a slow process in the Dark Ages, the medieval period, and in the early Renaissance of the 14th and 15th centuries, a very strange thing started to happen. The heavy point, the gravity of Western culture shifted from the old Mediterranean up through what had been primitive and tribal and savage and wild Gaul and Belgium and France. These countries began to be more prosperous and to be reawakened with classical ideas. What made this transference to Northwestern Europe from Italy and Greece? A variety of reasons. A Spain, a France, a Netherlands, a Great Britain, and even Bremen in Germany. These countries had ports that allowed them to go to the Atlantic. If they could go to the Atlantic, they developed seafaring vessels, sophisticated navigation, and they could tap into the wealth and the opportunities of South and North America, and also trade routes to India and China, much more economical and much safer than going through the Islamic Middle East. That was one difference. The second was the Reformation. This notion that classical culture, which had been absorbed by Christianity in a monolithic Catholic faith and an Orthodox faith, by the 15th and 16th century there was a critique of it. which prompted the Reformation and then the Catholic Counter-Reformation. But in this process, there was a component added to Western civilization that perhaps might have been lacking somewhat, both under classical culture and under Christianity and under the mix of the two. And that element that was missing was a enthusiastic embrace of material wealth. The classical cultures had felt that it was sort of money grubbing to get your hands dirty. The senatorial class, the old Greek hippies, they looked down at the mesoi, the middle people, or they looked down at the equestrians in Roman society. There was a notion you didn't want to get your hands dirty with insurance or shipping or banking. But with the Protestant Reformation, that idea was critiqued, especially the Catholic idea that, you know, it's easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than a wealthy man to go to heaven. Or don't worry about material inequality on this earth, because when you get to the next one, everything will be evened out. Protestantism introduced to the equation that maybe hard work would result in bounty and riches, and that would give you opportunities to spread God's word, and maybe even that it would allow you to show your faith by being rewarded in this world, and that would serve as a model for other citizens to say, he's very wealthy, he works hard, I want to do that as well. And the Christian community at large would be prosperous and therefore more able to spread the word of God. That was a new element that Protestantism introduced to the West, and it also had a salutary effect on Catholicism. If you look at a counter-Reformation church versus a pre-Reformation church, they're just different. They're more lively, they're more vibrant, they're lighter, they're more airy. It had a positive influence. And along with the Renaissance of the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, the development of classical ideals in painting, in literature, in philosophy, political science, the West really did take off again. And it took off not just in Italy or Florence or Rome, but up into Northern Europe. And along with the, as I said, the opening of the Atlantic ports, there was one other element, and that was Islam. Islam, whether it was the original caliphate, but more importantly, the rise of the Ottoman Turks, especially from the 15th to the 19th century, they controlled the Eastern Mediterranean. And the bulwark against them was the old classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. In other words, the Battle of Lepanto, or the siege of Constantinople, or the siege of Mistra. The Ottomans were not able to get easily up to the gates of Vienna. They did twice, but not easily, and they did not take Vienna. They were not able to get into Northern Europe because the old classical civilizations bore the brunt or the responsibility of that defense. Then there was the development of the European Enlightenment, specifically in France, Britain, Scotland, in which a new generation of thinkers tried to adjudicate natural phenomena not by religion or not by classical Aristotelian exegesis, but by a new empiricism. So if you read Voltaire or Rousseau or Montesquieu or David Hume, there was this notion that science and education could result in a new level of progress undreamed of by either classical civilization or Christian civilization, or the mixing of the two. And then we get into the rise of the New World, the United States, and the great economic power, and we are arriving at a Western-dominated world today. Now, why did that happen? Was there some rule that said only Westerners can succeed, only Europeans can succeed, only Americans can succeed? And the answer is no. Was it because there was democracy for 2,500 years? No. Is it because there was always capitalism? No. Is it because people with blue eyes were smarter than people with brown eyes? No. The people who inherited the Western cargo, who were in the Renaissance in Northern Europe, didn't look at all like classical Greeks who founded it. So what happened? And the answer is, it wasn't just that Westerners had perfect democracy, or they had perfect capitalism, or they had perfect individuality, or they had perfect free speech, or they had perfect rationalism, but they had a greater degree of it. What do I mean by that? In the West, whether we're talking about the Inquisition, or the barbarity of the Dark Ages, or medieval Europe, or the autocratic monarchies of the 16th century, whatever bleak period we're talking about Western civilization, there was a greater likelihood that someone was writing a treatise about mathematics or ballistics or navigation with less government coercion, censorship than was true in Baghdad, than was true in Peking, than was true in Japan. When we talk about the Inquisition, we're still talking about a few thousand that were tormented, tortured, killed, not tens of hundreds of thousands that happened elsewhere. So there was a greater likelihood that the Western dream that had grown up in Greece and Rome would prevail, but we don't need to demand that it be perfect at its inception, and it need to be always progressing and getting richer and expanding. It didn't. So we had a political, an economic, and an individual renaissance. And we could go on with notions of money and investment and insurance, shipbuilding, architecture, but they all reflect this idea that in the core, you allow a free individual to participate in a constitutional government and to pursue economic activity based on a market system of supply and demand, and that will create a more vibrant system. So today, whether it's Amazon or Google or Facebook, we're not going to see those in the non-West. They're not going to come out of Bolivia. They're not going to come out of Nigeria. And it's not because people are black or brown, it's just that they do not tap into the Western system to the same degree. Okay, I think we all pretty much agree with that, as politically incorrect as it may sound to some. So why would anybody want to criticize it? Why would anybody say, well, you know what, Westerners had slavery, Westerners had imperialism, Westerners had colonialism? Why do they say that? Well, they say that because with increased leisure and with it increased affluence comes increased self-criticism in a free society. So the point is, if you're progressing materially and you're progressing intellectually, you start to have illusions that you can be utopian, that you can be perfect, that if you're not perfect, you're not good. This is a very old Western idea. Take colonialism or imperialism or slavery. If we had time, I could make the argument that there were 11 million slaves shipped out of black Africa to the Arab world and 11 million shipped to the New World, and that a minority of the 11 million shipped to the New World ended up in the United States, originally at least. Most went to the Caribbean or South America. That doesn't matter. Americans will feel the responsibility much more heavily than will people in Saudi Arabia about slavery, because they have pretensions that they're free, they're self-introspective, their religion has to be examined, changed, modified, put under dissection, counter-argument in a way that Islam does not. So if we look at imperialism, I can make the argument that the Ottoman Empire, the imperialism practice out of Constantinople or Istanbul, was more coercive in the Eastern Mediterranean than was a subsequent British imperialism. It doesn't matter. The British feel that they have to end the slave trade, they have to end slavery, they are going to question their system much more than the tradition that arose in Istanbul. So what I'm getting at is simply this. The sins of the West are the sins of mankind. Everybody enslaves, practices racism, sends out colonies, practices imperialism. But in the West, and in the West alone, given this idea of consensuality and individuality and self-introspection, these are intolerable because we feel that we have the ability materially, philosophically, politically to get to a higher utopian, perfect level. Therefore, we are more culpable because we know better, is sort of what we're saying. It's a very arrogant attitude. It's like your parents saying, I cannot run a stop sign. My teenage driver can because he doesn't know any better. I can't. That's what the West assumes, that they have a greater responsibility to be perfect than other systems, and therefore they're much more self-critical. I think we all understand that as well. So who are these critics? Where do they come from? What are their names? What's their critique against the West? Essentially, they start in Greece, they go to Rome, they're in the church during the Dark Ages, the medieval ages, they're Renaissance thinkers, they're part of the Enlightenment, and they're here in America. I'll just give you some names and some general tropes of the arguments which they advance. Start in Greece. I'll make a statement. Do we know one Greek political thinker, one Greek social critic that was not critical of the West, i.e. Athens, Greek culture in general? I don't. If you were to read Aristophanes' comedies, if you were to read Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, if you were to read Aristotle's Politics, if you were to read Plato's Republic or Plato's Laws, if you were to read an anonymous treatise of the 5th century, the Old Oligarch's Constitution of Athens, we could go on, but if you were to read any of these, there is one basic theme: that we are engaged in a democratic experiment that does not work, that we are giving power and influence to people who don't deserve it. If we go to Rome and we were to read Suetonius's Lives of the 12 Caesars, if we were to read Tacitus's Germania, or Tacitus's Annals, or Tacitus's History, if we were to read a great novel by Petronius written somewhere around 65 AD in the Bay of Naples, the Satyricon, if we read Juvenal's satires, there's a common theme. What Rome makes a desert and it calls it peace. Rome subjugates people unfairly. Rome creates decadence. Rome makes people want to build a pier out into the ocean to build an unnecessary house. Women in Rome don't have children. They put all of their attention and time into makeup. Roman society is corrupt, it's decadent, it's effeminate, it's lost its agrarian ideal. If we were going to a next generation of critics, St. Jerome of the 5th century AD, St. Augustine, church fathers, what is their critique of Western civilization? That it's godless? Yes. That it has no moral element. That paganism did not teach people that they had a soul and the soul would survive in the next world and it would be adjudicated, its existence would be judged, adjudicated on the basis of whether it was moral, whether it shunned the material world, expressed faith in God, was kind, turned the other cheek, etc., etc. We get into the Renaissance. If you read Machiavelli or Petrarch, again, the classical critique appears that democracy or consensuality is making somebody who's not by nature capable equal with somebody who's far more capable, an aristocrat. Or he's trying to talk about how a monarch gets legitimacy within a constitutional system. If we're going to read the enlightened thinkers, Voltaire or Rousseau, their argument is that the West has gone too far into a material, artificial world, that people in the New World, Native Americans or people in Africa, which we came in contact in the West with, they're more natural. They understand nature. They understand natural medicines. They can understand the stars in a way that's not academic or scholastic, and we need to romanticize them. If we look at the Romantic movement, a Shelley or Keats, they feel that sophistication of 18th century life is unnatural, and it's typically Western. They want to go to Greece, or they want to go to a backward Italy and rediscover the energy and the primitivism of classical thought. We go into the modern period, the pragmatic movement or the progressive movement in the United States. The argument is that we have now conquered nature. We have a sophisticated science, and yet people are not what? They're not equal. Or in the West, they don't think in a sophisticated fashion. They need to be indoctrinated on how to treat one another better, or they need to understand the elements of science to replace tradition. So whatever stage of the West that we're at, there will be a critic to suggest that all of the splendor and freedom and material bounty, at least in comparison with alternate systems, is suspect. And there's something innately wrong with the West because it could do better. So what are all of these criticisms of the West that have been advanced over 2,500 years, from classical Greece to modern America? We don't have time to go through them all. You know some of them. The West desecrates or enslaves or colonizes, or on the other side of the equation, gives people power who haven't earned it, or supports people who don't work, or whatever the particular criticism is. They're multitude in number, but they tend to focus in two large general areas. One is this notion of human nature. Left and right, they have a different view of human nature throughout Western civilization. They've never quite solved this paradox. Some in the West have said, you know what? We all are born human. We have fingers and legs and heads, and we have superficial differences, but we all share a common humanity. And therefore, it makes no sense that when we come out of the womb looking the same, and for all, superficial purposes, we are the same, some of us die on the street. Some of us die in bed in a castle. What kind of system would allow that to warp or distort our common humanity? And therefore, we can create a system, a government system, an economic system, a political system that will ensure that just as we start out equally, we will have an equality of result. That is not new, that critique of Western civilization. That there's too much freedom, too much individualism, and therefore we need Plato's Republic, or Aristotle's agrarian state, where everybody has an equal parcel of land and they shouldn't be able to be alienated from it. Or we can go into socialism or communism under Marx, where the government will make us equal in a way that we were at birth and we'll all die equally. And the counter-argument, of course, is, well, these are superficial differences. Now, we may have, 5 fingers and we may have the same number of limbs, but we're very different people. You can have a German Shepherd and a German Shepherd, and they'll be very different German Shepherds. People are born into the world with different intelligences, different amounts of energy, different innate, differently character, besides behavior and environment. Some people are lucky, some people are unlucky, some people have good parents, some people have bad parents, some people have grandparents, aunts and uncles, 2 parents, some people are orphans. And if the state is going to come in and level all of that out, they will need a degree of power that's antithetical to Western freedom. We'll end up with something like the Soviet Union or Mao's Cultural Revolution that has to kill 20 or 30 million people to enforce equality. So here we are in the West with this same old dilemma. We have all of this idealism, we have all of this emphasis on personal freedom, we have all this emphasis on consensuality, but we don't know whether fairness and equality should come at the expense of freedom and individuality. And so we go back and forth, and now since the French Revolution, we use the term left and right. Republicanism versus radical democracy. Should we have a radical Athenian type of democracy? Should we have Republican representative government? So here in the United States, how is that working out? The critics of the present system say, you know what? It's not fair enough. There are 12 million people here residing, quote unquote, illegally from Mexico. They participate in a job, they participate and drive down the road, they participate in eating in a restaurant, and they cannot vote, just for the minor technicality that they didn't seem to get citizenship. We should allow them to vote. There are 17-year-olds who are more mature about things than 21-year-olds. Why can't 17 and 16-year-olds vote? If they were to vote, society would be much more liberal and progressive. And why can't we pay people to vote? They did in ancient Athens. Some people don't have the resources. They don't have a car. They have to work that day. They're selling shoes. Why not give everybody $200, $300 to participate? It would be a very different electorate, a more representative electorate. Or better yet, give somebody $100 to take somebody to the polls. Let's have the Motor Voter Act in every state, as Bill Clinton advocated, where you just go get your license and you sign up for a vote. In other words, let's make democracy as inclusive. All of this is not new. It got Plato so irritated. He says, the problem with democracy is people always vote on their own benefits. They always want more and more from themselves until they run out of somebody to pay for it. And they always want to make you equal. And they're not happy until the donkeys and the dogs are equal to people because of the expansive nature of democracy. And indeed, in our own country, the Founding Fathers had this crazy idea that property owners who showed sober and judicious attitudes about wealth creation, they didn't spend their money, they didn't take out loans, so they ended up with land. They left it to the states to decide who could participate in American democracy, landowners. And then that's not fair. I didn't inherit land. I'm a blacksmith. So, okay, during the Jacksonian Revolution, people who did not have land. But then how is slavery compatible with freedom and democracy? So then we've abolished slavery, and then people said, well, wait a minute, we're having people coming as indentured servants, or we have economic coercion on certain people. Well, let's stop that. And then the women said half the population is not participating. we have to have women as well. Then somebody said, you know what, you can die in Vietnam and you can be, for some reason, 18 and 19, but you surely can't drink and you can't vote until you're 21. Let's get rid of that age. And you can see the expansion and expansion and expansion, just as Plato predicted. On the other side of the coin, people will say, you know what, it's expanded too much because we are, as I said earlier, we're just superficially the same. And we need too much coercion to make us the same, and therefore we should have more restrictions on who should participate. So sometimes in the history of the West, you had to pass a literacy test. You should have to show at least an ID. You should have to have some type of certification that you're a citizen. Maybe the 18-year-old voting act is wrong. People don't pay taxes. They don't have property when they're 18. Maybe they're not responsible. They're not invested in the system. Let's have more restrictions so we get a better type of citizen. That age-old dilemma has not left us. And we are having the same critiques of Western civilization as the Greeks and the Romans did. There's another general area where people are dissatisfied with Western values and civilization and culture. And that's this notion of material wealth, scientific progress, advancement. And it generally runs along this line. If you have science, it's unfettered by religion or government. And if you have individuality, and if you have constitutional government, then you can progress from your natural state. Is that good or bad? Well, obviously, if you have brain surgery, you can take out a tumor and you can live. Otherwise, you would die. But if you don't know how to work in the real world, you're in an office all day and you're breathing, mold-filled antiseptic air, that's not good. And so throughout the West, there's been critiques of its very success. Well before Al Gore ever was heard of, there were people in Rome saying this is not natural. So what did Roman women do? They would sometimes put white lead makeup on their face so they would look like natural Germans, these white savages, that they would seem more natural, more alive, more vibrant. What did Tacitus do? He wrote something called the Germania, Germany. These people bathe in cold streams, they drink milk, they worship trees, are more connected with nature. This is Voltaire's idea that when our French explorers went into Canada, what did they find? They found people more in harmony, that were not contaminated by the West. Of course, Voltaire himself never wanted to quite do that. And no Western critic really wants to do what he advocates. Al Gore likes to fly on a private jet on occasion. He likes to have 4 or 5 homes. He would not like to live in the 800 square foot small domicile with a smart car that he advocates for others. That's another characteristic of Western skepticism, that the person who advances these critiques need not be subject to the ramifications of their own philosophies and recommendations. And so this other aspect then is that the very success of the West, material free, creates what the Romans called luxus, luxury, decadence. Juvenal said, you know what, there are these little Graculi, these little Greek people. They'll do anything, they'll invent this, they'll do this. And it's just the opposite of the Sophoclean idea that man is the most wonderful being. Polita dena, he can do anything. He can sail, he can farm. And we get a few hundred years later, and Juvenal says, yeah, and look what it's ended up with. Smelly, dirty, crowded Rome. That issue, where does it stand today? Well, it spawned the modern environmental movement, the Whole Foods movement, the notion that you must have organic pillowcases, the idea that if you see somebody who dresses antithetically to the norm, he doesn't wear a uniform like this, he wears his pants down, he wears a t-shirt, he has no shirt on at all, then he's more natural, and you try to emulate that. So we have this crazy phenomenon of very prosperous Asian and mostly Caucasian kids trying to adopt the dress, the lingo of the inner city, because they feel that their own success or their own fortune or their own parents' luck of the draw has made them less authentic than people who live in the barrio or the ghetto. They're advancing, in other words, a traditional critique of Western civilization that we've seen in the past. Now, so what? So people criticize the West, they have from day one. Does it ever do any good? Does it do anything badly? And the answer is yes and no. On the good sense, you could say today that man has never been more free and more prosperous than in the West. On the other hand, not always good. I mean, let's think of some things that are not good. I can start with World War I. The West, in suicidal fashion, imploded. 8 million Europeans were killed. How about World War II, where somebody like Hitler said, you know what I don't like about the West? They did not incorporate Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. They did not really appreciate Hegel. They did not appreciate Nietzsche. You know what they all said? There were Übermenschen, great men, and there were Untermenschen, subhumans. And there were Aryans, and Western society never got Germany incorporated in Rome, and therefore the Germans are a superior, unadulterated master race. And we're going to kill 50 million people, and the same thing was true of Japan, to prove that point. And then we've had a critique from communism that said, you know what, you never, ever achieved an equality result, and the ideas of Marx and Engels, when they were translated into Russian imperialism and the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the two greatest mass murders in history were people who killed on behalf of a Western idea of Marxism in Mao and Stalin. So we have to be careful that critiques of the West have to be within parameters, otherwise they become suicidal, self-destructive, nihilistic. What is the status of criticism today? Well, we're always going to have these ideas that we're not fair, or we're not free, or we have too many material things, or we don't have enough. But there's two new elements, I think, that have changed the equation. And one is the steady progress of scientific inquiry and high technology. And that, for the first time in our lifetimes, means that we can live like French princes or English kings did 200 years ago. We have made accessible big screen TVs, video games, cheap cars, air conditioning, hot water to everybody. And that has created a new critique that fairness and equality are absolute, no longer. They're relative. In other words, if I say that I'm poor today, somebody doesn't ask me, do you have hot water? Did you eat 3 meals? Do you have a car? Do you have access to a cell phone? Have you ever taken penicillin? Those would be the questions you would ask just 30 years ago. Today, I say I'm poor because I drove up here today in a Honda. Somebody had a BMW. I can't go to Europe. My house only has 900 square feet. He has 2,000. Fairness now is a relative matter. So when we hear from the president, pay your fair share, corporate fat cats, corporate jet owners. I can get on a plane today and I can fly to Washington, D.C. for $800. I'm kind of cramped, but is it unfair that I don't have a 50 million Gulfstream and get there an hour earlier? That's a new critique against the West, that fairness and equality is adjudicated in a relative rather than an absolute sense. That's something I don't know how we're going to deal with. And then there's another problem with the West, a new critique, and that is, who's West? What is Western? We are in a globalized world today. There are more democracies and constitutional governments than there's ever been today. Nobody stands up in the United Nations today and says, I hate Republican government. The United Nations is Republican in the sense that you have elected officials or supposedly consensual officials adjudicating things according to majority vote. I don't think anybody says, they say it, but they don't believe it, I don't want a capitalist system. I want a statist, socialist, communist system. The Chinese, the greatest communist power in the world, say we're communist, but you know what? We're practicing capitalism. And the result of that is, under Western-inspired globalization, if I say I'm a Westerner, there's no proof that I might not be in Seoul, South Korea. I might not be in Japan. I might not be in Peking. I might not be in Bolivia. Westernism then is a state of mind, and we have removed and are removing from the equation the notion that West is identified with Europe and West is identified with the United States or Canada or New Zealand or Australia or the former Commonwealth of Britain. Westernism now is an all-inclusive system, and when people are going to critique it, you may find somebody who's an Arab immigrant, somebody coming from Niger, somebody who's coming from Vietnam and living in Britain and living in the United States, defending the system that gave him opportunity against a fourth-generation American of any background who's kind of bored with the West. What's the future of the West? Well, we have to be very, very careful how we advance critiques of the West. We know that if it's done responsibly, as was true in the Renaissance or the Reformation, then it will hit an impasse. There will be counter-arguments made, there will be antitheses advanced, and there will be progress made. If we get disgusted with it and we say it's evil or it's too decadent or it's not fair, then we're liable to devolve into something like Hitler's Germany or Mao's China. And so the 21st century is going to be a very exciting time indeed.